Dr. Zoe Groves, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you, Anotida.
Wonderful. I'm very much happy to have you. How is your day going so far?
It's going very well, yes. Yeah, it's been a nice, bright, sunny day, and I've left the house today, so that's a bonus. I'm working from home these days, so don't get to go out as much as we're used to.
Oh, yeah. I understand. It's the life that we now all live during this lockdown. So, are you excited
Absolutely.
for the coming Christmas?
Yeah, I'm especially excited to have a bit of a break from teaching and marking.
But of course, research and writing never stops.
That's true. That's true.
Wonderful. Right. So let us get to start the discussion of the day. I do have questions for you with regards to the book that you wrote. A couple of questions, but before we get to talk about the book, I would just want you to briefly describe the academic journey that then gets us to this publication. How and when did you develop interest in studying African history?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I'll begin, I guess, with my undergraduate studies at Keele University. So also at Keele University, where I went on later to do my PhD. I studied international history as an undergraduate, and I was very keen to explore and learn more about the histories of other parts of the world beyond Britain and Europe, and beyond some of the sort of more conventional topics that we had studied at school and during A-levels. And I think in many ways the international history degree that I did was much more in line with the kind of history that we would think of today or describe today as global history. It was very much concerned with the histories of empire, colonial history, but from the perspective of the colonized, as much as exploring those dynamics of empire building and decolonization, and learning about histories of parts of the world in the formerly colonized world in their own right. And I was taught as an undergraduate by Professor David Maxwell, whose work you may have heard of. He's a historian who works on Zimbabwe and the histories of Christianity in Southern Africa. His more recent work has focused on the DRC, the Congo, and he offered what we call a special subject for third-year students, and this was a course that you take across the entire final year of your degree, and this was on the making of modern Zimbabwe, religion, politics, and society. And this was what sort of really I guess the point at which my curiosity about Zimbabwe began, having studied aspects of, as I said, sort of colonial and imperial history before. This is the point at which I started to focus more so on one particular country. And I ended up writing a dissertation in my final year on the history of Zimbabwe as well, focusing again on youth and politics in Zimbabwe during the sort of late colonial period and early years of independence. And from there, I went on to do a master's, developing some of that work, and then my PhD, which was also supervised by David Maxwell. And the way that I came to focusing, I suppose, on issues related to migration and Malawi was again sort of connected in some ways to David Maxwell's own research on histories of Christianity in Southern Africa. So we know that Malawians played a very important role in the spread of Christianity throughout parts of Southern Africa, the important work that they did, evangelizing and establishing new churches and so on throughout the region. So it was kind of taking that idea of the sort of movement of Malawians around the region and then developing that to think about Malawian migration more thoroughly. so that was how I arrived at the subject of Malawian migration for my PhD. So this book is actually based on my PhD research, but I've sort of since revised and developed some of those ideas. And just to provide a bit more context, I think following the completion of my PhD, I then went to, as you say, to South Africa, where I spent 2 years as a postdoc at Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research at Wits University. And that was a really great opportunity to learn more about South African history and to be sort of to connect with and scholars working on South Africa, but also other parts of the continent, to engage with the work of centres like the Centre for Migration and Society, the African Centre for Migration and Society at Wits, the History Workshop at Wits, and sort of, I guess, connecting with some of those who have produced their own really important work on migration histories, and particularly labour migration in Southern Africa.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wonderful, wonderful. That was quite a profound journey for you. Very exciting. So now I want to ask you something before we get again to the first question. As somebody who grew up in Europe and perhaps to say the United Kingdom in particular, and received early education and secondary education in that particular country, what were your perceptions of Africa and Africans before you got to the point at which you engaged some serious and deep tertiary education of the continent? What were your perceptions of the continent and of the people before that kind of exposure?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Again, I would say that I came to the subject with a great deal of ignorance. Mm-hmm. And that probably similarly to most people who haven't studied any African history at school, mm-hmm. I would have known very little about the histories in Africa, and very little again about sort of aspects to do with politics and culture and society. I suppose, I mean, it's before I embarked on my PhD research, I was lucky enough to be able to spend a year in Malawi and some time in South Africa as a tourist. And that was and traveling, and also I did do some voluntary work in a school in the north of Malawi, in a primary school, and so that was useful to have some time to get to know people in the country, and to some extent, which I think made it easier when I went back to begin my doctoral research. But yeah, I think you know, when I look back now, there's I would say that I didn't know very much at the beginning, and that it was a huge learning process, and that I was incredibly grateful to the Malawians and Zimbabweans, both sort of scholars and but also ordinary people who I was able to talk to and learn from during that process.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. So now let us get to the book. This was very interesting for me in particular because my people, especially my family, my like my great-great-grandfathers migrated from Malawi to Zimbabwe to look for jobs. So many of like the original Chikumbus, if I may say, come from Malawi. And like Chikumbu is like a very popular town in Malawi, a very popular place. And I can say lots of the other family is back there. So when I saw the title of this book, it's something that is interesting, not only for academic purposes, but for on a personal note, it's something that I really needed to have a discussion with somebody who wrote this work. So what would you consider to be the central argument of this book?
Yeah, thank you. I'd love to hear more about your own family's history as well. So perhaps we can talk about that after the recording. But yeah, in terms of the sort of core ideas of the book and the core arguments, in many ways it's focused on this idea that a culture of migration emerged in Malawi in the 20th century, and also exploring aspects of the kind of the history, but the legacies of that migration that continues to play out in different ways still today, as I'm sure you're aware. So Malawians are often, it's quite widely known within Southern Africa that Malawians played an important role in the regional sort of histories of labor migration. Huge numbers of Malawians worked in mines and on farms in both southern Rhodesia, as it was then, as well as in other parts of the region, especially in South Africa. But I think it's often the scale of Malawian migration, I think, is often underestimated, and the sort of the complexities of that as well. So what I've tried to do in the book is to draw attention to these kind of complexities, the extent to which migration has really shaped people's lives in Malawi, as well as shaping the Malawian nation in all kinds of really fundamental and important ways, and continues to do so today. And likewise, Malawians continue to play a very important role in shaping other parts of the region. And so what the book does is it offers a case study, if you like, of the city of Harare, or Salisbury as it was during the period of my study, and thinking in particular about the wider kind of cultural and political ideas and contributions that Malawians made to Zimbabwe.
Wonderful. That's excellent. So now, what was your research methodology? How did you come up with this narrative? What did you do? Was it interviews, or was it archival research? And if you can tell us about your sources, tell us what those sources informed you about this migration history.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I've tried to combine lots of different kinds of sources. And again, this is in order to build up a more complex picture of these migration histories. So I do use colonial archives from both Malawi and Zimbabwe, as well as certain archives based here in the UK. But I've also used oral histories and life histories. So I conducted a number of interviews, both in Malawi and in Zimbabwe. And I was interested to explore this history from both ends of the migration route. So to think about this from the perspective of migrants who returned to Malawi, but also migrants and Malawians who remained in Zimbabwe. As well as talking to the descendants of Malawian migrants in Zimbabwe today, who may see themselves like yourself as Zimbabwean Malawians. So second or third generation Malawians who have grown up in Zimbabwe, but who are very aware of their Malawian ancestry and that part of their identity. And so I think there is actually a great deal that we can find in the colonial archives using kind of missionary papers as well, missionary archives, and some of the sort of colonial era ethnographic work that that was conducted, and the sort of extensive labor reports that we have available in the colonial archives. So for example, there are letters which were sent between migrants or sent back to family members in Malawi. There are communications over issues to do with marriage, where migrants are writing to district commissioners in Zimbabwe or in southern Rhodesia And those district commissioners are then communicating with colonial officials back in Nyasaland, as it was. And so there is actually a lot more than just the kind of official view, if you like, of and just the sort of statistical and bureaucratic side of labour. We can actually learn quite a lot about the lives of migrants from the colonial archives. But what I think the oral histories and the life histories bring to this history is something more of the I guess those experiences obviously that aren't captured in the colonial archives, but for example, we read much less in the official archives about women who migrated, but we know that Malawian women did move to southern Rhodesia, sometimes independently, sometimes with other women, sometimes going in search of their husbands who had been absent from Nyasaland for many years without sending back remittances and so on. We know that entire families migrated in some cases from oral histories. We know we can learn much more about the extent to which they perceived that migration as being successful, to what extent it shaped their life on their return to Malawi. and I think, you know, we often sort of get the impression from a lot of the earlier labour histories in Southern Africa that labour migration in the region was about coercion and was about people sort of forced into this kind of harsh political economy, that people worked under poor conditions, they were received poor salaries, and that it didn't fundamentally kind of change or improve their lives. And actually, while that's certainly the case in many respects, it also doesn't tell those other stories of success and the ways that people were able to change their lives in a positive way, and the way that people could avoid some of those restrictions on their movement and decide where it was they wanted to work, leave a job and go to another one when and find sort of better working conditions, for example. So I guess it doesn't, those oral histories and life histories give us a sort of a fuller picture across a longer period of individuals' experiences. And they also, I think, importantly speak to issues related to citizenship and belonging, and some of those sort of important legacies of migration. So it was only on interviewing people of Malawian heritage and descent in Zimbabwe in 2008, 2009, when I conducted a lot of this research, that people talked to me about the changing citizenship laws in Zimbabwe, which had left some people effectively rendered stateless. Some people were no longer entitled to citizenship in Malawi, and they felt marginalized and excluded from citizenship in Zimbabwe.
Which makes them become more or less undocumented immigrants in a country that perhaps they have had a long history. They've been born there and they've grown up there, and for a very long time they've established like a huge family in that particular country. So I noticed that your book focuses specifically on the period from 1900 up to 1965. And from 1900, that is to say, just a couple of years, maybe 4, after the start of the Chimurengas and after the official imposition of colonial rule in Zimbabwe, and it ends in 1965. That is to say, just at the end of the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland. Why did you decide to focus specifically on this period? What explains your focus on this time?
Yeah, so the 1900 more or less marks a beginning of greater numbers of Malawians, or Nyasas, as I refer to them in many parts of the book, start to, higher numbers of Nyasas are migrating to southern Rhodesia from around that time. It's not the earliest period or the earliest migrations to southern Rhodesia or to South Africa. We know that people from Nyasaland are moving southwards from the 1890s and arguably even before, and also there are important migrations into the territory of Nyasaland before that period as well. But this really, I suppose, marks a point at which the numbers of Nyasa migrants going to Salisbury in particular start to become more noticeable according to the official records. And 1965 really, I mean, the book, the main focus of the study ends in 1965, but the final chapter actually looks at, as I said, these issues to do with the kind of legacies of migration. So it does kind of, one chapter of the book, the final chapter of the book does think about issues post-UDI. But in some ways, I think that provided 1965 provided a sort of a convenient cutoff date because of the quite significant changes in the politics of both Rhodesia as it becomes at that point and newly independent Malawi. Up until that stage, and you mentioned federation, obviously between 1953 and 1963, the two countries are much more closely interconnected, even before 1953, and through migration just being sort of one example. But with the creation of the Federation of the Rhodesias and Nyasaland, we have the two countries sort of the two colonies coming together, and in a really important way that I think we begin to see how the political trajectories are kind of shaping each other and connecting in interesting ways. So, for example, the sort of developments that we see in African nationalist politics in Nyasaland and Malawi start to have an impact on the organization of nationalist movements in southern Rhodesia. And because, I mean, Malawi then, the federation breaks up in 1963, Malawi gains independence in 1964, and things take a very different direction, obviously, in Rhodesia. And because of that, we see this kind of, I guess, a sort of movement away from these connections. And what I would argue is that even though people are still moving, even after 1965, you still have quite significant numbers of Malawians still moving to Zimbabwe, although lower numbers than previously. And you also obviously have still quite large numbers of Malawians living in Zimbabwe. But 1965, I guess, for the purposes of making the study a more manageable one, provided a sort of convenient cutoff point.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Thank you very much for that response. So now, what contribution does your book make to the general thinking of migration in the colonial times, or even in the present? What particular traits would you point to that we would attribute to say your book makes a significant contribution to this? Or if I may say, maybe does it in any way challenge conventional interpretations?
Yeah, I hope so. So I think one way in which it does is to challenge this notion or people's understanding of African migration. I mentioned just now this idea that people have of African migrations during the colonial era as being coerced or forced. Prior to that, obviously, what we know about African migration is largely in relation to histories of slavery. And while these are very important histories, it doesn't, there's more to say about African migration, and this doesn't capture accurately the experience, other experiences of African migration, which are free in some cases. So I think it challenges the stereotype that African migrations are always forced or coerced. And actually, there's a lot more to be said about free migration, both within the colonial era and today. And I think, even today, when people think of African migration, they're largely thinking of migration of Africans out of the continent. Migration of Africans, for example, across the Mediterranean coming into Europe. Mm-hmm. And again, we see that sort of that stereotype or that depiction of Africans as victims. Mm-hmm. And actually, historically, there has always been far more migration within the African continent. Mm-hmm. And so one of the important points that the book is making is that we need to explore these migrations and their histories and contemporary migration within the continent, as well as thinking about there's been some really important work, I think, in recent years on migrations across the Atlantic and connections with the Atlantic world and African migrants in that space. Likewise, with African migrations in the Indian Ocean world. But I think now that there's a lot more focus to be done on intercontinental migrations rather than transoceanic.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much, Dr. Zoe Groves. Viewers and listeners, this was Dr. Zoe Groves and her book, Malawian Migration to Zimbabwe, Tracing the Machona. This book can be accessed on the website of the Palgrave Macmillan Company, and you can purchase a copy from there. And as well, I'm going to paste a link in the comment sections where you can all click and get to see an abstract of the book, a preview that you can get to see online. Dr. Zoe Groves, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. This is the platform where I get to sit with established academics to discuss their outstanding publications about issues affecting the continent and affecting Zimbabwe in particular. I'm very much happy to have heard you. Have a good day.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Wonderful.